flu shot.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Joss Colchester. I'm with the SI London Hub, and I'm going to be walking you through today's session, learning about systems mapping. Let's get started. Still collecting a few people here, but we'll jump in. We're going to be working on a mirror board today. I'm not sure if you joined us before, but this is maybe the 6th, 7th, or 8th in a series of training sessions we're doing around systems innovation, or what it is and how to make it happen, all the ideas, tools, methods, and so forth. We're today looking at mapping. How do we map out a system that we're interested in changing? All of this is coming from content on our website, systemsinnovation.io. You'll find the series of guides there. And this one here is the one we're talking about today, systems mapping. You'll find that there. There's also a book under the section ebooks on systems dynamics, which goes more in depth on this. Both of those are freely available there. So you'll find them on the website. And that's where we're drawing all of today's content from. So today's session is going to be about an hour long. And it is being live streamed, so it is being recorded. And this is what we'll be covering. I'll show you now a quick overview. We're firstly going to talk about what systems maps are here, the very basic concept. This is very much an introductory lesson. We're going to start right at the beginning, the most basic aspects of systems mapping, and build upon that. Obviously, we only have 1 hour, so we'll be going quite quickly. After we've looked at what maps are, we'll be talking about causal maps, these causal links between different things in that map, how one thing affects another, and so on. If everybody could mute themselves, please. After that, we'll move on to these feedback loops here. You may have heard of those, an important part of systems thinking and systems dynamics in general. We'll be looking at maps as we go along, right? Getting examples of what these maps look like, increasingly more kind of advanced ones. And finally, we'll talk about systems archetypes here, and we'll try and get to building our own map towards the end here, right? Thinking about poverty and what are the factors that are leading into that, and what are the factors that leads to. So we'll try and get a chance to get there for you to be able to build your own maps and get an experience of that. So still letting people in here, but let's jump right in for the sake of time. So systems mapping, this is what we're talking about here. In our last session, we talked about, if you're with us, I'm not sure some of you were, others not, we talked about the model of a system. So you may be familiar with a system. It's a set of elements and relationships between them. And they form some overall organizations. We talked about this last time: elements, relations, function, input, output, boundary, environment, and so on. And that's really where this systems mapping is coming from, right? We're thinking about those elements and the relationship between them in that system, and the kind of interdependencies and the kind of dynamics that emerge out of those interrelationships between the parts. And we're trying to get an understanding of the system we're dealing with. So we're trying to think about what are those elements in the system and how are they interrelated. So that's the very basic model that we're talking about here. And if you remember, we looked at this pretty cool little map down here. We talked about, this is a gentleman making a cup of tea for himself here. And we looked at actually how it forms part of this big complex system of different factors that are interrelated. It's actually a system. We can see the inputs here and the outputs on the other side here. And yeah, natural resources, and they're being processed and so forth. A big set of interrelated elements and factors to get this cup of tea. So that's what we're talking about, a system. And you can see here, these are elements, oil, the trees and the factory and the water, these are all elements, and they're obviously interrelated in a particular way to deliver a function. So that's what we're talking about. That's a very basic idea. When I say systems mapping, that's what I'm talking about. So this is another little stylized example to give you an idea. This here might be a food system, right? You can see the elements in that food system. Obviously, we've got farmers, we've got retailers, we've got people doing the finance here, providing loans and so forth. We've got over here, this is part of the natural environments. We've got the climate, we've got soil. We obviously have technology, people providing tractors and so forth. We have factories processing this, consumers, media, and so forth. So this all forms a system, a food system. And yeah, that's what we're talking about when we talk about systems map. So I hope you get that basic concept. Down here is another simple example of a systems map. This is actually from the people who lead our Mumbai hub. They mapped out, there's a big issue in India around student depression in higher education and student suicide. So they were thinking about what are the factors that affect the students in higher education. So this is a very basic map. Again, we put the students at the center there. And around that, you can see the different elements and how they affect the students. So obviously the parents, friends, student bodies, faculty, admin, so on. And then they put kind of further out, more secondary factors that are affecting students, psychology and so forth, NGOs, media, campus, higher education, so on and so forth. And then, yeah, further out, different, more nodes and more interrelationships. So that's a very basic map, and even a basic model like that can be very helpful. Again, it's a holistic perspective, right? It's helping us grasp the whole, even if it's quite a crude kind of overview. It can be very helpful. So that's the model of a system. And here, why do we want to build systems map? It's a type of modeling that is designed to reveal the underlying interrelationships and structures of a complex system. Systems maps are powerful visualization tools that can help change agents describe and diagnose the current state of a given system, understand how system structure creates the observable outcomes. It helps us to create a shared vision of the system, gain a consensus about the problems, and identify opportunities. So, systems mapping is about gaining an empirical understanding of what is before we engage in envisioning what could be. Remember, this is all part of a process we'd be involved in as systems innovators to try and change a system. And this is one stage in that where we're trying to map out the system and get an understanding of it. However, systems maps should not be seen as deliverables or endpoints. Rather, they're tools of exploration, stepping stones on our path to understanding the system's dynamics and the underlying complex issue. So you're never really kind of finished with this. It's always something you're building upon. It's something you're building upon collectively, right? That's the idea. If we want to change the system, it's best done together, and these systems maps can help us gain a shared understanding of the system we're dealing with, so we can come to some consensus and then hopefully find points where we may intervene or how we may actually change that system. So that's the systems map, as I say, very basic model. Moving on here, we'll talk about these causal maps and these causal relationships, because that's of great interest. We can see this map here. Just kind of shows the system, but it doesn't really tell us about how things are actually affecting each other. It's not going to tell us about the dynamics, right? What happens if something changes here? Obviously, we're interested in change here. So we're interested in the question of how are things going to change if we affect one part? How will that affect another or some other part in a different part of the system? So that leads us to this idea of creating a causal map over here. And that's just asking about what are the relationships between these elements in the system, right? These linkages. How does one thing affect another? What are the types of causal relationships? So we can see here one example. And this is about when one variable changes, how does that affect another variable in the system? So here we're looking at the amount of rain in our garden, and we're saying, when that goes up or down, what's going to happen to the amount of snails in my garden? So my hypothesis would be that, when rain goes up, more rain, then there's probably more snails going to come out into my garden. So there I've identified some relationship, some causal relationship that's of great use to me, or of some use. And the opposite is probably true also. If it goes very dry and there's very little rain, probably not going to be many snails in my garden. If you go to a desert or somewhere, you're not going to find many snails. So I've identified a causal relationship of some kind. When one variable changes, another one is going to change in relation to that one. So that's the basic idea of a causal relationship. So then we can see, we might create kind of whole maps of kind of relationships between different things. When something here changes, then how's that going to affect something else? And that's going to affect something else, and that's going to affect something else. And this is getting to the whole dynamics of the system's dynamics, which is the name of this whole area also. But we can see here little pluses and little minuses. So what's that all about? Let's take a look at that. Because we know things may not always move in the same direction, right? We identified that if there's more rain, there's going to be more snails. And if there's less rain, probably going to be less snails. So they're both moving in the same direction. And we call that a positive correlation. But they could move in the opposite direction, right? And we call that a negative causal relationship. So there's two types here, positive and negative. And we just, to denote that in our map, we just put a plus or a minus at the end of the arrow, as you can see down here, right? When you're looking at causal loop diagrams, you'll see all these little pluses and minuses. And the pluses means it's a positive causal relation, which means if there's more of A, there'll be more of B. They move in the same direction. So the thing to remember here, and that most people get kind of stumble upon, is that positive doesn't mean that it's good, and it doesn't mean more, and negative doesn't mean that it's bad, and it doesn't mean less. What it does mean is it's a dynamic, right? It's a dynamic relationship between two variables. So positive means those variables move in the same direction. If one goes up, the other's going to go up. If one goes down, the other's going to go down. That's what we mean by positive. When we have a negative, they're going to move in the opposite direction. So when one goes up, the other goes down. When the other one goes up, this first one goes down. So more of A means less of B, and vice versa. So that's the trick to remember. If you start thinking that positive means more or better, and negative means less or worse, you'll get led astray. If you just remember that it's a dynamic relationship of how two things change in relationship to each other, and positive means they go in the same direction, negative means they go in opposite directions. So we can see here an example of that. This is migration, so more outward migration. So that's A here, the amount of our outward migration. If that goes up, this is a negative correlation. So if this goes up, outward migration, population, what's going to happen to population? Does anybody want to try this? What's going to happen here? Jean, do you want to tell us what's going to happen here? You're on mute, if you're able to unmute yourself.
So what? So if A increases, that means because it's an inverse relationship, B is likely to decrease.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So if we get more outward migration, population is going to go down, right? As this goes up, that's going to go down. So that's what I mean by that kind of dynamic where they're moving in opposite directions. Okay, so over here is a positive one, like the one I looked at with our snails and the rain, more snails, so on and so forth. But this one here is about basketball. And it's saying, if I practice more basketball, then what's going to happen to my proficiency? Does anybody want to try this one? Proficiency is how good you are at this activity. What's going to happen here? Anybody?
I'll try myself at this one.
Yep.
Just Ulysses here. So eventually he says that the more you practice, the better you become. Right? Your proficiency will increase.
Yeah. And what's the opposite? What's going to happen? The less I practice,
well, the less proficient I will be, right?
Yeah.
And just like the other one was saying, the outward migration with the population, the more people leave the place, the less population we'll have, right?
Yeah. So these are moving in opposite directions. This one's moving in the same direction, right? So this is all, it's actually very simple, right? It's one of these ideas in complex systems, simple rules. When you get lots of interaction, we can get the emergence of complex behavior. And you can see here, it's actually very simple, but the trick is to remember that it's a dynamic. It's not about more or less, it's about the way they're moving in relation to each other. Okay, so here is an example. Anybody want to try and walk me through this? So up here, we can see this is about student achievement in school. And we've got 4 factors around that, right? And we're asking, how do these variables move in relation to the variable of achievement, how well that student is achieving in school? So up here, we've got students' native ability. So if their native ability goes up, this is a positive causal relation. What's going to happen to their school achievement? Anybody?
Their school achievement should increase, but those other factors like family stress and teacher talent, like if you're a really smart student, but you've got a lot of family stress and a poor teacher, the way that they interact, it may not follow that standard curve.
Yep, there can be other factors involved. But what this here is saying, just given these 2 factors, just looking at these, they're going to move in the same direction. So student native ability, if that's good, if that goes up, the higher that is, the higher their potential for achieving in school. So over here, family stress. So if there's more family stress, this is a negative correlation. So what's going to happen here? Anybody else want to try more family stress? Student achievement in school? Anybody?
Well, less family stress should be increased achievement.
Less, that's one way of looking at it. So less family stress, they should do better at school, right? So there again, we can see they're moving in opposite directions. More family stress, probably going to do worse in school, moving in opposite directions. So down here, we've got another positive one. So teacher talent. You know, I know this is very basic, guys, but if you just learn this and you get it in your brain, it's very simple when we're looking at it like this, but afterwards you're going to be looking at more complex things that look like this, and you're going to have to be making sense of them. So if you really get this solid in your mind, then it gets a lot simpler. Otherwise you'll get confused when you look at more complex things. That's why I'm kind of putting emphasis. And I know from teaching people that they think they've got it, but then they don't actually. So it's worth kind of focusing on this. So teacher talent and resources. So if that goes up, this is a positive, so they're going to move in the same direction. So if teacher talent and resource goes up, student achievement is going to go up. So here's a negative causal link. So substance abuse in community, if they're from a disadvantaged community, they're probably not going to do as well, achieve as well in school. So that's a negative correlation. They go in opposite directions. Okay, so hopefully you have this idea now. Let's look at some maps to get an idea of what this looks like in practice. This one here is an interesting one. They're asking about the quality of life for waste pickers in Mumbai. So this is people trying to figure out what's affecting the quality of life for waste pickers on the dumps of Mumbai. And they've drawn a a causal loop diagram, and you can see all the elements. You know, the amount of waste in landfills, breeding ground for diseases, air pollution, fire hazards, safety threats, shortage of land, space occupied by landfills. And then they're drawing lines between them, what affects what. And they're putting in those little pluses and minuses. So let's take a look at this. Anybody want to try and walk me through this a little bit? We could start here. The amount of waste in landfills. So if that goes up, let's go all the way up here, space occupied by landfills. So if the amount of waste in landfills, if there's more of that, there's a positive link with space occupied by landfills. What's going to happen to the space occupied by landfills?
So the shortage of land will increase.
Yeah, more
And
land.
this is-
Yeah, so you skipped ahead there, right? So you went all the way from the amount of waste in landfills. So
Yeah.
then that's going to mean more space occupied landfills, which is going to mean more shortage of land as a positive correlation. And then what happens here? It's a negative one. So what happens here? Someone explain? Jan?
In that case, it would mean that the more shortage of land there is, the lower the quality of life for the waste pickers will be.
Yep, that's what this map is telling us.
Yeah. So it's funny
okay.
because it's quite important how you describe the nodes, isn't it? Because
Yes.
so sometimes
Yes.
there's also something like something positive or negative in it in the description if you don't watch out.
So I think that's a dangerous thing to do, and the variable should be more pure. It's the amount of land available.
Yeah.
Your
Exactly.
kid,
Yeah.
it's got a variable within a variable.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be careful with all of these.
Available land, and then it would become negative availability of land.
Yep. I'm not sure. Do we have Hannah with us at this stage? She was supposed to be my co-host today. I'm not sure if she's made it. Are you with us, Hannah? No. Not yet. Okay, no worries. Okay, let's stay going. We're just trying to learn the idea here. Amount of waste in landfills. So breeding ground for diseases. So it's saying more waste in landfills, more breeding ground for diseases. More breeding ground for diseases, health problems for urban dwellers. Makes sense. And then it kind of stops there. Okay, so if we go down here, waste incineration at landfill sites. Yes, we know those are going to lead to more waste incineration, more air pollution, very likely, which is then again leading into health problems here. Surprised they don't maybe link those two up. No. Yeah. So waste pickers sorting waste down here. So the number of waste pickers sorting waste positively correlated waste picker income level. Is that right? Waste pickers sorting waste. Okay, their overall, if there's more people sorting waste, I guess their overall income is going to be more because there's more of them. I guess that's what it's saying. And if there's more income, potentially better quality of life for waste pickers.
But what you're beginning to tease out now is there are some assumptions that are not explicit. The assumption is we're talking about the group income increases rather than the individual persons.
Yeah.
So you've got to be careful with that.
Yeah, you do, because it's very difficult actually to come in and look at a map that someone else made and just draw out from the signs and symbols what's going on here. You'd really want the person who made these maps to be talking to you about it. Particularly when they get more complex, we find that there's certain things that we really have to think about before they make sense. Anyway, we're really making the signs and symbols and how this works for the moment. So let's take a look at this one. This is Amazon deforestation and the effects of that. They have up here soybean, maize cultivation. They're putting global demand for beef here, net deforestation goals here, biodiversity, climate change, CO2. So they're saying this is a system, all of these things are interrelated, and they're interrelated in a particular way. So anybody want to talk us through, if we start here, global demand for beef, if there's more, well, let's say there's more, right? More people in China eating beef burgers. Anybody want to follow this one through? What's happening then? Do you want to talk to me about what's happening with maize being cultivation or clearing for cattle pasture?
I'll have a go. It seems to me that as demand for beef increases, there's competition for pasture, and as a result, there's a reduction in the soybean and maize cultivation. There is clearing of land or forest to increase cattle pasture, which leads to deforestation in the Amazon.
Yeah. So levels of rainfall is an interesting one. I don't know if someone understands this. So if there's more deforestation, it's saying here there's going to be higher levels of rainfall. I'm not sure exactly the dynamics are there, but do you want to stay going? Levels of rainfall and tree dying and death?
Level of rainfall increasing. Well, according to the map, if the rainfall increases, there is a increase in the death rate of trees, which in turn leads to an increase in the CO2 emissions, which I suspect is part of the nullification of the sequestration of CO2, which in turn leads to an increase in climate change. The increase in climate change leads to a decrease in rainfall, so there's a loop back
Great
into that previous process.
Yeah, so we'll get to loops now in a minute, but thank you very much for that. So here's another one, thinking about smoking and all the different factors around that, the systems dynamics that are affecting this. So we could start all the way out here. So this is how permitted is smoking in the home or workplace. So we can see that's positively correlated with tobacco use among family and friends. So more acceptance, probably more people using the substance. Again, it's positively correlated with normalization of smoking. People around you smoking, there's probably going to be a culture that's normalized, it's okay. Normalization of smoking as a culture is probably going to lead to more smoking. Let's look where else over here. So neighborhood segregation, negatively correlated with social capital. So someone want to walk me through this? What's happening here? Neighborhood segregation, follow this social capital, stress and smoking. Someone want to say that one?
Well, I can speak from the perspective of the United States that when you do have segregated neighborhoods, people tend to stick to their own groups. And so then social capital decreases, right? Because there's no interaction between different social groups. That obviously leads to decreased opportunity and increased stress. So,
so we've got here neighborhood segregation. If that goes up, we're going to have less social capital. If social capital goes down, this is saying stress is going to go up. So both these are negatively correlated. Stress goes up, positively correlated with smoking, we're going to get more smoking.
For the point of practice, wouldn't it be valuable to also read that as segregation goes down, social capital goes up? Because I think there's questions in the comment section about relationship. You should probably read it both ways.
You should read it both ways, because that's what this is saying. It's saying it goes both ways because it's a dynamic. Right, it's not saying it just goes in one direction. It does help to read it in both directions so that you understand it's a dynamic, right? If social capital goes up, then stress may go down, and if stress goes down, then smoking may go. The amount of smoking, stress goes down. Yeah, it's positively correlated, so the amount of smoking may go down. Okay. So another one. This was actually a lady from our Barcelona hub. Was part of producing this. It's looking at regenerative agriculture and all the factors affecting that. So an interesting one here. Many different factors, right? This is a complex system, right? Food systems like this, markets and purchasing, retail, waste, preparation and consumption, local production, so on and so forth. We're not going to dig into all of this now, but you can see, you know, in real life, if you're dealing with a complex system, mapping out like this, it takes time. You don't do a map like this in a couple of days. It takes weeks and months to get something like this. And that's the kind of reality of a systems change project. It would look more like this, and it's kind of a long-term ongoing process of development, building something like this. Okay, so there we go. We've talked about what a map is in terms of all these nodes and relationships between it, just to get an overview of what's going on. It's giving us a visual representation. We do it together so that we can hopefully all have our input, and we can also have those discussions as we go along, the kinds that we did to figure out, does it make sense? You think this and I think that, and we're going to have a discussion, because this is not, you know, an algorithm or something. We're a community, should we say, and we're trying to figure out how the system we form part of actually operates, and come to some consensus on that, because the way may be divergent. There often is divergent kind of understanding of that, and going through this process, doing it together, helps us to understand and come to consensus about that. So that was the first part on mapping, and then we talked about these causal relations, right? The positive and negative. Very basic concepts, but we can see it can kind of build up to a complex system like this, and a whole set of dynamics that are going on in that system because of these positive and negative relationships, causal relationships. Okay. Someone just touched upon it there, this idea of a feedback loop. Maybe you've heard of that, part of the whole systems thinking and dynamic system dynamics mapping and figuring out what's going on, is that one thing doesn't just affect another. It's kind of a linear view of the world. Actually, there's quite often feedback loops. We would have seen many of them there, right? Back in this past one here, multiple feedback loops going on there, where one thing affects another, which affects another, which affects another, and so on, and then ultimately it comes all the way back. That can be a very simple one. We saw a couple back here, you know, this one here around normalization of smoking and the amount of smoking, and then straight back again. You can see there's a feedback loop there. The more people are smoking, probably going to lead to more normalization of smoking, and more normalization of smoking, potentially more people smoking. So that's actually a very direct feedback loop there, but you can see there are other ones that are intermediated, like smoking affecting, well, maybe that's not the best example, but there are other ones over here which are intermediated, right? We've got this circle here through a long series of linkages. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about a feedback loop, and it's good to grasp the basic concepts. How does one thing affect another, and then that feeds back to the first? So again, there's two types, negative and positive. Negative feedback loop is called a balancing loop, because one thing affects another. If one goes up, the other moves in the same direction, but then it comes back to move in the opposite direction again, so it rebalances it. This here, we'll look at these now in a second. This here is a positive amplifying feedback loop. So one thing affects another. A affects B, they move in the same direction. So if A goes up, B goes up. But then when B goes up, that feeds back to affect A to make it again go up more. All right, we just looked at the smoking example there. So that means it's just going to stay augmenting or decreasing, right? Because it's dynamic, it can go up or down. It's amplifying, right? More of the first is going to create more of the second. That's going to feed back to create more of the first. Whereas this one here is a balancing one, because when this goes up, that goes up, but then it comes back to rebalance the first. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. This is a balancing loop here. we have some prey, rabbits here. And actually, this is how ecosystems maintain balance and order and stability to some extent through a lot of these negative feedback loops. And this is a core one, but this is one of the most prominent ones, right? This relationship between predators and prey within an ecosystem. So this is a balancing feedback, balancing loop here. Anybody want to try this one? If we have more rabbits, anybody want to walk me through this one?
Fabienne, yeah. If there's more rabbits, then there's going to be enough food for the predators to have more offspring. And as the offspring grows up, then they're going to eat more food and the number of rabbits will go down. So it gets to a balance at some point.
Yeah, you kind of want to stay going too, because then there's less prey is going to lead to less predators again, and then that can lead to more prey again. And you can see actually it's going to keep on kind of cycling, isn't it? If we get more prey, it's going to have more prey, more predators, and it's going to feed back to less prey, but then it's going to be less predators, and that's going to be more prey. So actually it's going to keep on kind of balancing itself and kind of oscillating, like the dynamics over time. We're talking about the dynamics over time. They're going to oscillate. Sorry, do you want to say, Fabienne?
Yeah, and would you see that without any other event happening, then the oscillation might be getting smaller and smaller amplitude to a balance until something happens that gets that off balance, or is it maybe jumping ahead to say that?
No, because there's a delay in the system, right? It's not as soon as you have more predators, they aren't suddenly going to, straight away eat all the prey. If this has offspring, it's probably going to take some time for those offspring to be raised. And so that's actually going to create a delay, which is going to create a continuous oscillation over time. Okay, so let's then look at this. Anybody, this is population here. Anybody want to walk me through this? This is an amplifying feedback loop. So what's going on here between population and births? If population goes up, anybody? Anthony?
Yeah, hi, sorry, I could not connect earlier, but yeah, if the population starts to increase, of course, more people are starting to, of course, more people will, more births will happen, and afterwards the population will increase, so it will, as it says, reinforce itself, because more population equals more people and more births. More people probably are going to get married, or more people are going to create more births. So it's something that it's going to, in consequence, generate more and more people. So it will,
amplifying, isn't it? It's self-reinforcing. And what sort of graph are we going to get here? It's going to grow exponentially. It's going to go like this, isn't it? Shooting up, right? More creates more. We see this maybe if you have some bacteria in a petri dish and you throw some food in, and that's what happens to them, right? When they get a bit of food, they start growing exponentially because of this positive feedback loop. But we know at the end of the day, they're going to eat all that food, and what's going to happen? All going to come crashing back down because there's no more food.
Or you see it in innovation, even when you see it in innovation, when it starts slowly, and then when if you can generate a good culture, it can explode, but it generates, you have some sort of a flat curve, but then it in some point will explode. So yeah, I can see that also happening with other people, even in innovation, creating ideas, for instance.
Yeah, and it happens across all kinds of complex systems. This is essentially how complex systems go through phase transitions, and they flip very quickly from one state to another. Financial crisis is going in the opposite direction, right? Loss of faith, a bank run, loss of faith in a bank. Other people see that, they go and take their money out. Other people see them taking their money out, so they lose faith, they take their money out. More people taking their money out, more people losing faith. Very quickly the system can crash. So it can go in both directions. Exponentially degrade, which we call a collapse, a financial crash, or exponentially grow. And that happens across all kinds of complex systems, ecosystems, the collapse of coral reefs, so on and so forth. Let's not dwell upon that. So that's a feedback loop, obviously a very basic dynamics one we're looking at there. These feedback loops, as we mentioned, they can be intermediated between more links, more nodes and more links than just an immediate one, A affecting B and B affecting A. Here we can see a balancing loop that's between three nodes. So this is about a company producing quality products. We have a company producing quality products here. That's going to, better quality, more customer satisfaction here. Customer satisfaction is going to affect demand for products. More customer satisfaction, more demand for products, which is going to feed back. And again, here built in is a kind of hypothesis that if this company has a huge demand for products, huge demand for their product, they may not be able to provide it. They're trying to meet that demand, and they may not be able to deliver the same quality if they're trying to scale and mass produce these things. So it's saying that this here is actually going to move in the opposite direction to this. So there's more demand. If they're overloaded with demand, they won't be able to, the quality will probably go down. So this here is a balancing feedback loop between those different factors, mediated between three. This is a amplifying positive feedback loop between three variables. So the development of a tourism sector, average price per night is here. If that goes up, tourist industry revenue obviously going to go up if they're all earning more per night. Quality of hotel infrastructure. So the idea is if the hotels are all earning more money, the government could potentially take would gain more tax and could invest it in better quality infrastructure, or whatever way that increase in gross revenue could translate into increased in hotel infrastructure, which if they have better infrastructure, better hotels and so forth, they could then charge more per night. So this is called a virtuous cycle, right? We can see something, if it's really working like this, then things are looking pretty good. And this does play out in the development of a nation's infrastructure and economy. When it goes through industrialization, better technology infrastructure, better transport, we would have seen this in China and so forth, better infrastructure, they could get better at manufacturing, producing goods and so forth. The government can get more tax from them, invest in it, so on and so forth. This one, reinforcing, again, a little bit more complex. It's the same kind of dynamic around tax base. So let's just start here. Attractiveness of business. More attractive a place is for business, the number of private businesses will go up. More private businesses, larger tax base, they can reduce the tax rate. If they reduce the tax rate, the expected benefits for businesses will go up because they're being taxed less. If the expected benefits for business go up, the more attractive that place is. So you do see this, play out in tax in again, in China, in places like Shenzhen or Shanghai, where they're able to trade free zones, should we say, they can reduce the tax, but then corporations come in and they invest a lot, and they can get positive amplifying virtuous cycles, we would call this, this one here. Can also work in the opposite direction of vicious cycle too. Any pressing questions anybody has at this time? We obviously want to stay going, but if someone has a really pressing question, they can unmute themselves.
I have a quick question.
A bit louder, please. I can't quite hear you.
Sorry, is there a limit to how complex you can make these systems thinking maps?
Well, let's take a look here. We've got some complex ones, right? So this is one of the most complex ones I've seen. It's obesity. So this was a long-term initiative by this organization called Shift N. And I think it was funded by the British government, who are trying to understand the dynamics surrounding obesity. And it's very complex. I've looked at some of this, very interesting to explore it. Obviously don't have time here now, but to answer your question, yeah, at the end of the day, how much kind of, at the end of the day, you want to do something with this, right? So I would say it's a question of how much complexity can you deal with and still turn it into something productive that makes sense to people. So when they came up with this, yeah, I mean, could you put that in front of a policymaker or someone who's going to do something about obesity? they probably wouldn't be able to look at it and they wouldn't be able to concentrate and so forth. So it's a good question. But if you can turn this into something productive, then you can deal with a lot of complexity. But yeah, you do have to turn it into something productive, and it's all relative to the complexity of the system you're dealing with too. This is a very complex issue, obesity, right? There are many factors in it, so you do have to kind of represent. If you're doing something realistic, you can see here, these are the different dimensions to it they're dealing with. And these are the factors that affect obesity: media, social factors, psychology, economics, food, activity, infrastructure, so on and so forth. So this is a complex issue, and you do need to dig into all that complexity. So here, this one is about, again, it's in the UK, it's the same organization. Joni, did you have a quick question?
I did, and I thought I saw another item in the chat that kind of related to it, which is about thresholds or limits. And like, for instance, just going back even to the snails, at some point there's too much water for the snail. So that's kind of one increases, the other increases, or vice versa. Is there a way to symbolize those limits, or do you do it by just adding other similar elements in the systems diagram?
Yeah, it's kind of getting into stock and flow diagrams and the whole systems dynamics, right? So if you want to actually simulate the whole system properly, then that's kind of going a level beyond this to talk about stock and flows and things like delays and things like this. So it's not quite included in what we're dealing with here, but when you're creating a simulation, you can put in those things like delays and buffers and limits and so on and so forth. Yeah. Okay, so this one here is about land use in the United Kingdom, trying to understand what's affecting that. I think this was sponsored by the government, and again, a lot of complexity there, looking at all the different factors that are affecting land usage.
And just really quickly, the arrows represent plus, positive, and the dotted line with a box at the end indicating negative.
Yeah, they have, they illustrate it, let me see here. Well, in this other one here, they do illustrate positive influence or negative influence. Yeah, so it's not normally how you do it. You know, normally you do put the pluses and minuses in. So here's another one. One of my favorite ones, COVID, right? Different factors affecting that. And you can see here, the feedback loops, or the feedback loops, right? You see R is for reinforcing. It's a positive feedback loop. So let's take a look at one of those. This is an interesting one. Trust in government and misinformation, right? So less trust in government, the more people are prone to accept misinformation about their government and the situation. And then again, the more misinformation, the less likely they are to trust in their government, because that information is often against the government and its protocols and so forth. So that's a reinforcing loop there also, a direct one. Yeah, some interesting stuff going on here. You can see these double line there, that's symbolizing there's a time delay. So it takes time, it's saying here, misinformation and fake news are related to panic and fear, but it doesn't play through immediately. So they're saying there's a time delay there. You can see here, they group them into different areas at the top: environmental factors, all affecting the situation with COVID. The gray ones here in the center are government interventions, what government is doing about this. Down here, the social, cultural ones, and health over here, and so forth. So very, very interesting little map. Let's stay going. I do want us to get a chance to put up some stickies and post some stuff. I'm just going to quickly touch on this. So yeah, let me just summarize what we did there. We talked about maps originally, and then we talked about these causal relations, and then we just jumped into the idea of feedback loops, right? These positive and negative, amplifying, dampening, and these are going to affect the dynamics of the system over time. And we started to look at some of these maps with those feedback loops incorporated into them. So now we come just briefly to touch on this, the idea of archetypes. Archetypes are commonly seen reoccurring patterns within systems that lead to certain patterns of behavior that we see reoccurring across different kinds of systems. For example, the arms race, right? So this is obviously a reinforcing feedback loop, right? So when governments, when the USSR increased its stock of nuclear weapons, well, then the United States says, we have to increase our stock of weapons. And then the USSR says, oh, well, they've got more weapons now, we have to get more. So it's reinforcing. And we can see that same dynamic, in advertising or competition between two businesses, or whatever it is. It could be in a relationship with your partner. Something like this. So we can see there's an underlying dynamic that isn't just specific to military escalation. That could be found in economics, it could be found in different social settings and so forth. Actually, you find these in ecosystems too, where some creatures are developing new strategies for attacking other creatures, and then the other creature have to develop, bigger, stronger weaponization on their body to deal with these first ones. So you can see it's an archetype, it's an underlying dynamic that we'll see across different systems. And that's a very basic one. We get slightly more advanced ones here. This one's called shifting the burden. So we have a problem in the here in the center, and instead of or quick fixes, I think it's also called, they have a number of names, these archetypes. So the real solution to obesity is to get on a bike and do some exercise. But here he's shifting the burden and saying, actually, no, let's find a quick fix, some drugs or something. But that quick fix, it has negative side effects. It's going to make it more difficult for him over time to do the fundamental thing that needs to be done, right? And we know that happens in politics, it happens in organizations, happens in culture, so on and so forth. So that's one archetype, shifting the burden. This one here is a rich get richer. We definitely know this happens in economics and finance. Big banks get richer, and other people who don't have money get poorer, and that's the dynamic going on. Happens too, with parents and their children. We start to favorize one child, and we think that child's doing well because we put more. What this is really saying is that we give our attention or our resources to the successful. Whichever one of these two is successful, we give our resources to it. And because we're giving our resources to it, it's going to end up more successful because we did that in the past, right? So we just keep on giving it to that node, irrespective of which one is better. We keep on giving it to it, and that's rich success to the successful, because we didn't do it for this one in the past. This one's a bit impoverished, so if we give it now, they aren't as successful. Yeah, again, these archetypes are in the guide. You can take a look at those. The one I showed you at the beginning, there's more there. And let's move on to, I'll share the mirror board with you. What we're going to do is, hopefully I have it here. Someone seems to have already shared it with you. Actually, maybe I'll grab the link to this board. We're going to do a little map of the factors affecting poverty. What's leading into it? If you could click on the second one, it might be better. And please join me here. So we've got poverty here in Brazil. And we want to know what leads in, on the right-hand side here, what leads into poverty, right? So lack of income directly leads into poverty, right? But there are many other things that indirectly lead into poverty, right? There are many other things that lead to lack of income, right? Lack of job would lead to lack of income. And then on the other side, there are things that lead out of poverty, right? If you're poor, you're probably not going to get as good at education and so forth. So I'd like for you to grab a sticky. Stickies are here on the left, or you just double click on the board and it will create a sticky for you, and then type up the factor that you think is affecting, any factor that you think is affecting poverty, the state of being in poverty. If you think it's directly affected to it, draw a line into it. If you think there's another thing that affects, that then affects poverty, then put in that line of different factors. And of course, what leads out of it also. So let's take a minute to do that. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself or put them in the chat. Okay, let's take a little look at what you've come up with here. So we've got poverty in Brazil in the center there. We've got wealthy country demand on resources. Yeah, but wealthy country demand on resources is not going to lead directly to poverty, right? So what actually makes you poor? It's good to step back from that, like take the problem at the center there, and then step back one and say, okay, if I'm poor, how exactly do I get there, right? So you get there by not having any money, right? That's what poverty is, or lack of income, right? If you don't have any money, that's directly going to get you there. But wealthy countries' demand on resources is going to be, you know, back up here, because that's going to affect yeah, resources availability or something in the country, which are going to affect, you know, job opportunities or things like this, which would lead into jobs, which would lead into income, so on and so forth. So you got to create the chains of causal relations. So gender inequality, yes, potentially. Corruption, yeah, definitely. But there's going to be a few links there also, aren't there? Less consumption could probably lead to like not so many jobs, and jobs again into lack of income. Lack of education, again, there'd be another step there, right? Lack of education doesn't necessarily make you poor. Lack of education will lead to underemployment or lack of employment, which again will lead to limited income. So a lot of surrounding factors. Lack of living wage jobs. Yes, that could be quite closely correlated, actually, because that could mean quite a few underpaid jobs, so on and so forth. Unemployment, yes, that's going to be pretty okay. That leads to fewer job opportunities. Fewer job opportunities would lead to yeah, lack of income pretty directly. And then on the other side here, so poverty is going to lead into bad governance, potentially. Lack of education, quite likely. It can also lead to health, also poor health. You're probably living in a poor neighborhood and you don't have money for organic food and so forth. Quite likely you're going to end up with poor health outcomes. And well, actually, let's take a look at this over here, because I have these people here have done this map, right? They're trying to figure out what's going on here, and they came up with some interesting stuff. There's poverty in the center, lack of incomes leading directly into it, unemployment's leading into that, inadequate livelihood, diverted funds, right? So we've got stuff around corruption over here, which leads to diversion of funds, which leads to lack of income, leads to poverty, austerity policies, cuts to government spending, reduced assistance, lack of income. So then on the other side, they've got the things that lead out of it, right? So poverty, obviously leads to lack of capital. You're not going to have any money. Yeah, it can be difficult to get a good education. Lack of services, very likely, inadequate housing. And then this one here, lack of healthcare leads to illness, leads to unemployment, back to lack of income, back to poverty. That there we call the poverty trap. And we can see there's a few feedback loops going on here, right? A few loops where if you're in poverty, you're going to circle back into the factors that create poverty. And it's going to be very difficult to get out of it. So then that would lead us to places we might intervene in this system, right? We might try and change some of these factors so that we don't get this cycle leading back again into poverty, and people are able to make their way out of the poverty trap. So that's what we're going to wrap up now. We'll come to the end of our hour, but that's what I mean by this is part of the process, understanding the system. And when we get this understanding, then we're in a much better position to understand the dynamics and what's going on and where we may intervene, right? Which is ultimately the next step in the process if we want to change a system. So we'll come to the end of our time and we're going to leave it there. I hope that was helpful. And we covered a lot of ground, right? We took a look at quite a few little maps here. Hope you understand what this is about, the causal relationships, the feedback loops, archetypes, so on and so forth. And this was just a taster. I encourage you to look further into our guides or other information you'll find out there on the internet. This one here on system dynamics. I'll unlock this. So you just click on this link here. It'll take you to that book or this guide here. And you can read more there also. Okay, we'll wrap up there for now. Actually, our next learning session is kind of a continuation of this. We'll be talking about actor mapping and mapping out the stakeholders and actors within the system. We'll be doing that next month and we'll list it on the website so you can join again next month. Okay, guys, thank you very much for joining and hope to see you again soon.